An old man could get used to being kept.
2 months earlier, I reached Quill Creek with sewing tools and no intention of staying. Theodore was 58, widowed 8 years, and determined to need nobody, even as his clothes fell apart.
I manage my own mending well enough.
His ruined socks, mismatched buttons, and lonely kitchen told a different story. I accepted a winter arrangement. Soon, while I mended his clothes, he quietly repaired my wagon and freezing room. But he was 33 years older, and I had spent 3 years belonging only to the road. Then, Wendell Copeland arrived, young, respectable, and everything the town believed I should choose.
I heard you walked out with young Copeland.
That evening, one honest answer waited between us. It began with the sock Theodore swore did not need mending. Quill Creek, Nevada Territory, 1883. There's a particular kind of self-sufficiency a man builds when he has spent decades managing entirely on his own, the understanding that asking for help, however small, generally cost more pride than the help itself was worth. Theodore Ashby had built exactly that kind of self-sufficiency over 8 years, ever since his wife Prudence had died of a fever that took her over one hard week, and I had come to know him, over that particular winter, as precisely the sort of man who would rather wear a boot through than admit the sock inside it needed mending. I am Clementine Ward, and I had spent the better part of 3 years working as an itinerant seamstress, traveling between the scattered ranches and mining camps of the territory, taking in mending and alterations wherever the work could be found, staying through a season and moving on once the local demand thinned. I was 25 years old, and the trade suited my own restless nature well enough, though the constant travel left little room for anything resembling a settled life, a fact I had mostly made peace with by that particular winter. My father had died when I was young enough that I barely remembered him, and my mother's death some years later had left me with little beyond her own sewing tools and the trade she had taught me thoroughly, so the road had become, over 3 years, less a hardship than simply the shape my own independent life had settled into. Theodore Ashby was 58 years old and ran one of the most respected mule breeding operations in the territory, a business he had built up over 3 decades from his own father's modest herd into an operation ranchers throughout 3 counties relied upon for reliable, well-trained stock. He was broad and weathered from a lifetime of hard outdoor work, his hair and beard gone fully gray, his hands scarred and capable in the particular way of a man who handled difficult animals for a living. He employed several hands through the busy seasons, but managed largely alone through the quiet winter months, a solitude that suited him, he generally claimed, perfectly well, though the claim had come over 8 years to sound considerably more like a well-rehearsed defense than a genuine assessment of his own preferences. Quill Creek sat in a narrow valley along the creek that gave the town its name, a modest but steady settlement with a mercantile, a church, a small schoolhouse, and Theodore's own considerable mule operation standing at the valley's northern edge, his careful breeding work known throughout the territory, even as his own personal circumstances had settled into something considerably quieter than his professional reputation suggested. The town regarded his solitary habits with a particular mixture of respect and mild concern. Small settlements generally extended to a widower who managed too thoroughly alone, several of the older residents having quietly discussed among themselves over the years whether a man ought to be doing quite so much for himself at his particular age. His days ran early and demanding. Dawn work with the herd, long hours training whatever difficult animal needed his particular patient attention, evenings spent alone over his own account books and whatever plain supper he managed to cook. A schedule so unvarying that his own hired hands had learned to set their watches by his particular morning routine. My own mother, a seamstress herself before her early death, used to tell me that mended things generally lasted longer and served better than things simply replaced, an instruction I had carried into my own trade. And it was that same instruction, more than any particular business calculation, that first brought me to Theodore Ashby's door that particular December. It was in early December, with the first hard snow of the season already settling deep, that I arrived in Quill Creek looking for winter work, and found, through the usual channels, a traveling seamstress relied upon, that Theodore Ashby's household had gone without proper mending for the better part of a year, his previous arrangement having ended when his last hired housekeeper married and moved on that autumn, a circumstance several townspeople mentioned to me with the particular knowing tone of people who considered the household's current state something of a local curiosity. I called at his ranch house, offering my services plainly, and found him considerably more resistant to the offer than most clients generally were. "I manage my own mending well enough," he said, by way of greeting, which was, I noted immediately, not strictly true given the visible state of the frayed cuff on the shirt he wore. "I am certain you manage," I said, which was, I felt, the more diplomatic response available to me in that particular moment. "I'm simply offering to manage it better, and for a fair wage besides." He was quiet a long moment, standing near his own kitchen table, this broad, weathered man clearly unaccustomed to being challenged on the quality of his own self-sufficiency, and finally, with visible reluctance, agreed to a trial arrangement through the worst of the winter months. That first evening, going through the considerable pile of mending his own attempts had left in various states of incompetent repair. I discovered the true scope of the problem: socks worn through at the heel and clumsily, ineffectively patched, shirts missing buttons replaced with mismatched substitutes, a whole winter's accumulated evidence of a proud man doing poorly at a task he refused to properly delegate, the kind of well-meaning but genuinely hopeless repair work that made me wonder, not for the first time in my trade, how many men across the territory were quietly suffering through similarly disastrous self-mending rather than simply asking for help. "You have been making this considerably harder on yourself than it truly needed to be," I told him, holding up a sock so thoroughly mismanaged it had very nearly become unsalvageable. "I generally manage," he said again, quietly, though with somewhat less conviction than his first assertion had carried. That should have been the whole of it, a practical winter arrangement between a traveling seamstress and a self-sufficient rancher, the kind of transaction that happens regularly in territory towns and generally ends cleanly once the season turns. Except that the arrangement, once properly established, revealed a man considerably more interesting than his gruff self-sufficiency initially suggested, and I found myself, over the following weeks, genuinely enjoying the quiet evening hours spent mending his considerable backlog while he worked through his own account books at the same table, the two of us settling into an easy, companionable silence neither of us had particularly planned. "You did not have to sort my whole sock drawer while you were at it," he told me, some weeks into the arrangement, having discovered his previously chaotic drawer transformed into something properly organized. "I know," I said quietly. Seemed a foolish thing to leave good work half-finished when I had already started it properly. Theodore, in turn, began noticing things about my own circumstances, the fact that my own travel gear had grown considerably worn from 3 years of constant road use, and he began, without much comment, seeing to small repairs on my own wagon and equipment whenever I was occupied with his own mending, work I generally discovered only after it was already completed. "I know you did not have to fix my wagon wheel on top of everything else," I told him, the first time I noticed the repair. "I know," he said, echoing my own words back at me with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. Seemed a foolish thing to let good equipment sit broken when I had the tools and the evening hours to spare. It was in January that a particularly hard, cold snap settled over the valley, and I noticed the small room I had taken for the winter, a modest space above the mercantile, held the cold considerably worse than my own comfort strictly allowed, the single stove struggling against drafts that whistled through poorly fitted window frames, my own breath sometimes visible in the room's coldest corners, even with the stove properly stoked. Without mentioning a word of it to me, Theodore spent a full Saturday afternoon at the mercantile, working alongside its owner to properly seal every draft in my rented room, gone again before I returned that evening to find the room finally holding proper warmth. "You did not have to see to my drafty windows," I told him, discovering the work the following morning. "I know," he said. Seemed a foolish thing to let a hard-working woman freeze through a Nevada winter when I had the tools and the know-how to prevent it easily enough. He kept an old, considerably stubborn mule named Persimmon, who generally tolerated nobody beyond Theodore himself, the animal's temperament having earned her a reputation throughout the territory for genuine unpleasantness, several ranchers having declined outright to purchase offspring from her simply on the strength of her own difficult disposition, a reputation Theodore himself never once disputed and, if anything, seemed to privately regard with a certain fond amusement, and Persimmon took to me with an immediacy that surprised even Theodore, the mule following me around the property with an attentiveness she showed nobody else, as though the animal had already settled a question the two humans involved were still working through separately. The town noticed, as small towns invariably do. Mrs. Beulah Farnsworth, who ran the mercantile, remarked to her husband that Theodore Ashby's household seemed to be running considerably more smoothly than his usual solitary winters generally allowed, and old Aldous Rourke, who had known Theodore for decades, observed that the rancher had taken to coming into town for supplies with rather more regularity than his actual needs strictly required, a pattern several longtime customers began quietly remarking upon within their first few observations of it. I told myself I was simply completing a fair winter arrangement, the plain practical sense any traveling seamstress would make of steady employment through the hardest months. Theodore told himself he was simply managing his household efficiently, nothing more complicated than good practical sense. Neither explanation held up especially well under close examination, but neither of us examined it too closely, because the examining threatened to surface something both of us had reasons to leave carefully alone, each of us privately suspecting, without ever once saying so aloud, that the other might reach a very different conclusion given the chance. My own fear, when I finally sat with it honestly one evening after a long day's mending, wore a shape considerably larger than I generally allowed myself to properly examine. I was 25 years old, and Theodore was 58, 33 years my senior, a man of genuine standing throughout the territory, and every practical instinct I possessed insisted that whatever warmth had grown between us belonged strictly to the category of employer and hired seamstress, that a woman of my own restless, unsettled nature had no genuine business wanting anything as permanent as what I found myself increasingly wanting from a man so thoroughly rooted in one place, a man whose whole life had been built around staying exactly where his father had planted him 3 decades prior. I filed the matter into the safest available category and told myself the category would hold, even as it grew steadily less convincing. With every evening, I found myself genuinely looking forward to. Theodore's own fear, I came to understand much later, wore an older, more weathered shape entirely. He had spent 8 years since his wife's death building a reputation as a man who managed his own affairs and required nobody's assistance, and the thought of caring for a woman young enough to be, by any reasonable accounting, closer to a daughter's age than a wife's, felt like exactly the kind of foolishness that could unravel 8 years of hard-won independent standing in a single season of town gossip. He had watched other widowers in the county remarry sensibly, women closer to their own age, and had privately assumed, without much examination, that whenever he himself considered remarrying, if he ever did, the arrangement would look considerably more conventional than whatever was quietly building between himself and his own hired seamstress. It was around this time that a respectable rancher named Wendell Copeland, considerably closer to my own age, began finding regular excuses to call at the ranch under various pretenses, an interest Mrs. Farnsworth observed with evident approval, certain that a young man near my own age represented precisely the match a traveling seamstress ought to seriously consider settling for. Mrs. Farnsworth remarked to anyone who would listen at the mercantile counter that Copeland stood to inherit a respectable operation of his own within a few years, and represented exactly the kind of sensible, age-appropriate match a woman still building her own uncertain future ought to properly welcome. I want to pause the story here for just a moment, because this is exactly the point where a woman who has spent weeks insisting her feelings were only practical employment has to watch a more conventional, age-appropriate suitor step forward with every practical advantage on his side. I'd spent weeks telling myself that what I felt for Theodore was simple professional satisfaction. I was about to discover exactly how much that insistence cost me. Watching it nearly hand my whole attention to a perfectly pleasant man I felt considerably less for than I felt darning socks at Theodore Ashby's own kitchen table. If you have been enjoying this story tonight, I would love to know whereabouts in the world you are listening from, whether that is somewhere here in the United States, up across the border in Canada, over in the United Kingdom or Australia, or anywhere else this old story happens to have found its way to. Do drop your country down in the comments below. It genuinely means a great deal to us to see how far these tales travel. Now, let us get back to Quill Creek, because I'm about to learn something about my own stubborn heart that Theodore Ashby already seemed to understand. I accepted Wendell Copeland's invitation to walk with him one afternoon, telling myself repeatedly that it was exactly the sensible choice a practical woman ought to make, and told myself this with such determined frequency that I very nearly believed it, right up until that same evening, returning to Theodore's kitchen table with my mending basket as I had done every evening for weeks by then, when he looked up from his own account books with an expression I had not previously seen from him. "I heard you walked out with young Copeland this afternoon," he said, forgoing any pretense of routine evening business. "Word travels fast in a town this size," I said, setting my basket down, careful to keep my own voice as steady and unremarkable as the observation itself. "It generally does," he said. "I expect he is a perfectly decent young man." "He is," I said. "I do not feel about him the way I feel sitting at this particular table every evening, though." Theodore was quiet a long moment, studying me with an expression I could not immediately read, the kitchen lamp catching the gray in his beard. "And how do you feel, sitting at this particular table every evening?" he finally asked. "Considerably more than a fair winter arrangement generally accounts for," I said, plain. Having decided somewhere in that walk with Wendell Copeland, that plainness was the only honest option remaining to me. I have spent weeks telling myself otherwise, and I am rather tired of pretending. He was quiet another long moment, and when he finally spoke, there was something dry and careful in it, the same tone he had used that very first evening discussing his considerable sock drawer, though this time the words carried a weight the earlier exchange had never once approached. "An old man could get used to being kept," he said, half a joke, though I heard underneath it something considerably more serious asking to be properly answered. "Is that a joke?" I asked, "or an actual question?" "Both," he admitted. "I am 58 years old, Clementine, 33 years your senior. I have spent 8 years believing myself poorly suited to anybody's close company, and I do not entirely trust my own judgment on whether wanting yours as thoroughly as I apparently do is wisdom or simple foolishness dressed up in an old man's gray beard, though I have turned the question over more times these past weeks than I care to properly admit." "Then, let me answer plainly, since you are asking," I said. "I've been mending your socks and sorting your drawers and organizing your whole considerable household for 2 months now, Theodore. Tasks that ought to have felt like ordinary employment and never once did. I could have stopped any time the errand felt like simple employment. It has never once felt like simple employment. If that is not being kept in whatever sense you actually mean it, I do not know a better word for what it has actually become, and I have grown considerably tired of pretending otherwise." The kitchen held very still, evening settling around the small ranch house, somewhere nearby Persimmon shifting in her stall with a low, contented sound, the lamp between us casting warm, steady light across the table where so much of this had actually begun. Theodore looked at me a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something quieter and more certain than his usual measured tone. "Then I suppose an old man ought to properly ask you to stay on," he said, "if that is genuinely what this has become." "I suppose he ought to," I said, and Theodore Ashby, 58 years old and certain until roughly that very conversation that close attachment was simply not a comfort life had properly suited him for, crossed the small distance of his own kitchen and kissed me, careful and certain both at once, his own weathered hands surprisingly gentle, while Persimmon thumped against her stall wall in what I chose, even then, to understand as clear approval. Word moved through Quill Creek with predictable speed once our courtship became evident. Mrs. Farnsworth declared she had suspected it since the wagon wheel repair, a claim she repeated with considerable satisfaction to anyone at the Mercantile willing to hear it more than once. Wendell Copeland took the disappointment with reasonable grace, admitting to Mrs. Farnsworth that he had sensed these past weeks that my attention had settled somewhere his own courtship could not properly compete with, and old Aldous Rourke claimed with evident satisfaction that he had known it the moment Persimmon started following me around the property, a claim he made often enough in the weeks that followed that several fellow ranchers began gently reminding him the wedding had, in fact, already happened. We married that following spring in a small ceremony at the Quill Creek Church, with a considerable portion of the county in attendance. Curiosity about the territory's most notable widower finally settling, drawing a crowd considerably larger than either of us had expected, several of Theodore's own hired hands standing awkwardly proud near the back pews in their least worn work clothes. I wore light blue rather than any traditional bridal white, having decided that a woman ought to be married in whatever genuinely suited her, rather than whatever convention demanded, and Theodore later told me I looked, standing at the front of that small church, exactly as striking as he had quietly believed since that first evening discussing his considerable sock drawer. His hands, steady enough handling difficult animals for 3 decades, trembled slightly saying his vows, a fact I would tease him about gently for years afterward. And when it came his turn to speak beyond the standard words, he told me plainly that he had spent 8 years believing himself poorly suited to close attachment, and that I had proven, one darned sock and one repaired wagon wheel at a time, that a man could be entirely wrong about his own settled assessment of his own nature, a confession that drew a soft, surprised laugh from more than one guest seated close enough to properly hear it. Old Aldous Rourke, watching from a pew near the back, was overheard remarking afterward that he had never once witnessed a courtship conducted so thoroughly through mended socks and sealed windows, and doubted he ever would again. A sentiment several fellow ranchers echoed as the whole small church settled into the particular warm commotion that follows any wedding a county has watched unfold slowly, one quiet act of care at a time. Our first year together settled into a rhythm neither of us had fully expected, my own considerable travel finally settling into permanent residence, my seamstress trade continuing from a proper shop I established in town, while Theodore's mule operation ran, if anything, more smoothly than before, with a properly managed household behind it, our combined income growing steadily as word of both trades spread throughout the surrounding valleys. He built me a proper workroom that first spring, sized and lit exactly to the demanding needs of my trade, because he had noticed, without my mentioning it twice, precisely what my growing business needed, framing the whole careful addition himself over several evenings, once his own spring breeding season eased. Mrs. Farnsworth took to remarking at the mercantile that the Ashby household had never run so smoothly in her considerable memory of doing business with the family, a compliment that reached me secondhand and settled something in me that 3 years of constant travel had never quite managed to properly quiet, the particular relief of hearing from an outside voice that the life I was building had visibly, genuinely taken root. It was not without its harder moments. That following autumn, Theodore's old knee injury, a legacy of decades handling difficult animals, began troubling him considerably worse than it previously had, slowing his work in ways that frustrated him more than he let show, some mornings requiring a full hour of careful movement before the joint loosened enough for the demanding physical work his trade required. I found myself, more than one long night, watching him work through simple tasks with visible discomfort and turning over a fear I had never quite let myself name fully, that I had married a man whose old injuries might, in time, ask more of both of us than I had originally accounted for, a fear that sharpened considerably whenever I watched him grimace through some ordinary chore he would once have managed without a second thought. Theodore, noticing my troubled quiet, did not brush past it. He told me plainly that the knee would likely trouble him further with the years, that he could not promise an easy road through every season ahead, but that he would always tell me the truth of how he was faring rather than hide it out of some misguided notion of sparing my worry. And I, hearing him choose honesty over false comfort, found the fear easing into something I could carry rather than something that carried me. By the following spring, he had hired a young apprentice specifically to handle the most demanding animal work, a practical adjustment he made without complaint once I gently pointed out that a stubborn knee rarely improved by being repeatedly tested against the territory's most difficult mules. And I found, watching him train the young man patiently through his first uncertain months, that Theodore possessed a genuine gift for teaching that his previously solitary years had never given him much occasion to properly discover in himself. 2 years passed, and on a bright December morning, almost exactly to the day since I had first arrived at his door offering my services, I stood in the doorway of my own proper shop. Our young daughter Prudence Rose, coppery-haired like myself, balanced on my hip and reaching toward the falling snow with delighted, fearless hands, the whole shop humming with the particular quiet satisfaction of a business genuinely, steadily thriving. Old Persimmon, considerably grayer around her muzzle now, still made her way to the shop's back fence most mornings, waiting patiently for whichever of us happened to be closest to offer her particular attention, a devotion the whole town had long since accepted as simply another fixed feature of our own household. Still darning socks in December, Theodore observed, coming in from the mule pens for his midday coffee, snow dusting his broad shoulders, his own gait steady despite the previous autumn's difficult stretch. "I am," I said, smiling. "Old habits. An old man still gets used to being kept," he said, and meant it entirely. In every sense, a settled, thoroughly content man could mean such a thing. "Good thing I never properly stopped," I said, and he laughed, the particular easy sound that had become, over 2 years, as familiar to the household as the wind against the barn walls. "You know," he said, once his laughter settled, wiping his eyes with the back of one broad hand, "I still think about that first evening, standing in my own kitchen insisting I managed my mending well enough." "You managed it considerably worse than well enough," I said. "I have the mismatched buttons to prove it, tucked away in a drawer I never quite worked up the nerve to properly discard." He conceded the point with a rueful, genuine smile, and reached to take our daughter into his own arms so I could properly finish closing up the shop for the day. I want to stop here for just a moment before we close this story out, because I believe there is something in it worth sitting with tonight. We often assume that fierce self-sufficiency is simply strength, that a person who manages entirely alone has achieved something admirable rather than something that might, in its own quiet way, be costing them considerable comfort they no longer allow themselves to properly want. Theodore Ashby spent 8 years believing his own solitary competence was simply good, practical character, never once examining whether the pride behind it might be quietly costing him a warmth he still, underneath all that careful independence, genuinely wanted. There is a particular loneliness hiding inside the phrase "I manage well enough," a claim that sounds like contentment, but often functions as a wall built specifically to keep genuine help at a safe, manageable distance. Theodore's mismatched buttons and clumsily patched socks were never really evidence of poor sewing skill. They were evidence of a man who had convinced himself that needing anyone, even for something as small as a properly darned sock, represented a failure rather than simply an ordinary human thing to occasionally require. His joke that evening, telling me an old man could get used to being kept, could have landed as simple deflection, a way of laughing off something he was not yet prepared to claim honestly. Instead, spoken with his own particular dry warmth, it became the very door through which we both finally walked, the joke itself doing the brave work neither of us had quite managed with plain speech alone. Sometimes the truest partnership is not built on grand romantic gestures, but on the plain, patient willingness to let somebody else properly mend what pride alone had left quietly, stubbornly broken. Thank you so much for spending this hour with me and with Theodore tonight, wherever in this wide world you happen to be listening from. I would love to know down in the comments, were you rooting for us from that very first sock drawer? Or did it take you a little longer to trust that this particular kind of quiet care was the real thing? If this story kept you good company this evening, a like on this video and a subscribe to the channel mean a great deal to us and cost you nothing at all. And if you know someone who might need a quiet, gentle hour like this one, please do consider passing it along to them. Wherever you are tonight, I hope somebody lets you properly mend whatever pride alone has left them stubbornly carrying. And I hope you find the courage to ask for that mending before pride convinces you it is entirely unnecessary. Until next time, keep riding.